You've heard this a million times. Rome fell because of the barbarians, decadence, corruption, crazy emperors, wild banquets, moral decline. It's the standard package we repeat almost automatically. But what if that explanation is incomplete, almost superficial? What if the real reason the Roman Empire fell isn't only in the final dramatic acts, the invasions, the sacks, the broken walls, but centuries before that? In small choices, in silent power gains, and in a very peculiar relationship with time itself. Imagine that the entire history of Rome is a giant clock, a complex mechanism. From the outside, it looks perfect, polished metal, firm hands, marking the hours with precision. But inside, you have worn-out gears, chipped teeth, and improvised fixes nobody sees. For a long time, that clock keeps working, even with internal problems, because there's always a workaround, a clever fix, a quick solution to keep everything running a little longer. Eventually, though, that stops working. It's not a single blow that destroys the clock. It's accumulated where Rome is exactly that. For centuries, it was an empire that looked solid from the outside but was corroding from within, until one day it simply couldn't hold together anymore. That's what we're going to do here. Instead of only staring at the dramatic final fall, we're going to go back in time, well before 476, to see how this clock was built, how people tried to tune it, how they forced it to run faster than it should, and how that decision came with an enormous price. If you really want to understand why Rome fell, and why that matters more than it seems, stay with me until the end. And before we go deeper, do me a favor, hit the like button, share this video with someone who loves history, and subscribe to the channel. We're going on a long, immersive journey through the rise and fall of an empire that decided to play with time. To start, let's step away from official documents and step into the world of myth. Not because myth is literally true in a modern historical sense, but because it reveals how a people like to see themselves. In Rome's case, the most famous founding myth is that of Romulus and Remus, two twins abandoned by a river, supposedly suckled by a she-wolf, rescued, raised by shepherds, and when they grow up, they decide to found a city. They argue about where it should be, who should rule. Tensions rise, the signs of the gods are interpreted differently, and the story ends with one brother killing the other. Romulus kills Remus. If we strip away the fantasy layer, something incredibly meaningful remains. In its own symbolic narrative, Rome is born from an act in which one brother kills another in the name of power and the city. That reveals a mentality, a way of thinking, the idea that building something grand, a city. Later, an empire justifies extreme sacrifice. That the authority of the founder is worth more than personal bonds. That victory, in the end, legitimizes everything. It doesn't matter so much what actually happened in the 8th century BCE. What matters is that Romans told this story about themselves. They saw themselves as heirs of a violent founding act, where power beats affection, where the project of the city comes before the brother. This mentality appears in different forms throughout Rome's history. In critical moments, Rome is always ready to sacrifice something, a group, a tradition, a rule, a part of its own system, in exchange for a bigger promise: stability, expansion, glory, survival. The myth of Romulus and Remus is like symbolic DNA, playing out on a larger scale. Trade a brother for a city, a law for a military victory, internal balance for external expansion. Every time this logic is triggered, another gear is tightened just a little beyond its safe limit. Now, let's look at a detail that, at first glance, seems technical, even boring, but is absolutely central to understanding Rome: time. Not time in an abstract, philosophical sense, but time as measured, counted, and manipulated through calendars, political mandates, election dates, intercalated months. In the Roman Republic, the calendar was a tool of power. It wasn't neutral, objective, just reflecting the Earth's orbit around the sun. It was adjusted, tweaked, manipulated. In several periods of Republican history, certain religious and political authorities had the power to insert extra days, extend the year, and play with the calendar in ways that had real consequences. Prolonging a magistrate's term in office, delaying elections, favoring or harming specific groups. Instead of time being a rigid line everyone must adapt to, time becomes something moldable, stretched, or compressed according to the interests of those at the top. It's like rewriting the clock from the inside. That says a lot about how Rome understands time. Not as a limit, but as something that can be tamed. If a political problem is too big, you can literally buy time by changing the year. If a crisis is about to explode, you can postpone decisions, push tensions a few months ahead, reorganize the calendar. And very often, this worked. Rome was a master of temporary fixes, delays, patchwork solutions that looked brilliant in the moment. But imagine what happens when this mentality is repeated over decades, centuries. Instead of confronting certain issues head-on, inequality, concentration of power, institutional strain, the limits of expansion, the system slowly builds a culture of postponement. It solves what's urgent, but pushes the structural problems forward. It buys time now and pays more later. It's the logic of rolling debt endlessly, of problems that are never actually resolved, only displaced. We see a big example of this dynamic in the Punic Wars, especially in the struggle against Carthage and the figure of Hannibal. Rome faces an existential threat, almost gets destroyed, suffers devastating defeats, watches its allies waver. And still, it insists, resists, changes, strategies, mobilizes impressive resources. In the end, Rome wins. And not only wins, it annihilates Carthage, takes control of vast territories, dominates the Western Mediterranean, and becomes an unrivaled power in that region. On the surface, it looks like the peak of strategic brilliance. But let's look at the cost. Years and years of war mean farmers away from their land, fields abandoned, growing concentration of wealth in the hands of those who handle public contracts, taxes, plunder, and supply for the army. Many small landowners return ruined, unable to resume their previous lives. Meanwhile, the elite gets richer than ever. To relieve the tension, Rome passes agrarian laws, distributes land here and there, makes small reforms. But again, the root of the problem, the way the economic system is reorganizing around war and expansion, isn't really fixed. Military success comes with severe internal cracks. Here, the buying time mentality shows up in a different form. The empire gets used to the idea that internal problems can be temporarily pushed back by the promise of new conquests, new tributes, new flows of wealth. It's like paying one loan with money from a bigger loan. Expansion becomes not just a path, but almost a structural necessity. And once that happens, the internal clock now depends on something dangerous. A rhythm of expansion that, sooner or later, will hit limits. At the same time, the political structure of the Republic is showing strain. Institutions built for a relatively small city-state are now trying to control a territory spanning multiple continents. The Senate, assemblies, magistrates, consuls, all of that was designed for a much smaller scale. As Rome grows, those old gears begin to grind. New offices are created, new compromises are made, new combinations of power tested. But again, nearly always as patches, not as deep reconstruction. This is when we start to see figures concentrating exceptional powers, generals with armies loyal to them, not to the state, personal alliances overshadowing traditional forms, deals among a handful of powerful men who, in practice, set the pace of politics. The so-called triumvirate, for example, is one of these arrangements. In theory, it's a pragmatic solution to handle crises. In practice, it's another sign that the Republican machine was no longer managing reality on its own. So, the transition from republic to empire isn't a sudden cut, as if everything changed overnight. It's the result of accumulated tensions, improvised fixes, and solutions designed for right now, without thinking seriously about consequences 100 years from now. When Julius Caesar crosses the Rubicon, he isn't just crossing a river. Symbolically, he's crossing a line between a system still trying to respect certain forms and another one willing to break them in the name of immediate effectiveness. When he is assassinated, it's not just a man who falls. It's a violent confession that the institutions alone can no longer keep the balance. Then comes Augustus, the first emperor, with a seductive promise. He will restore order to chaos. And, to a large extent, he does. He reforms the army, reorganizes provinces, creates clearer administrative structures, and brings a sense of order after decades of civil war. The famous Pax Romana is born from this arrangement. But look at the price. In order to restore order, Rome accepts concentrating an absurd amount of power in a single center. The empire's time, the time of decisions, laws, military campaigns, starts to depend heavily on the figure of the emperor. On the surface, this works. The clock finally seems calibrated. But now a new fragility has been created. If the health of the clock depends so heavily on one piece, any failure in that piece can have enormous consequences. Competent, prudent emperors can prolong stability. Unstable, violent, or simply mediocre emperors can accelerate internal decay. The system becomes more efficient in many ways, but also more vulnerable to internal imbalance. The obsession with control continues, including in its relationship with time. Calendars are reformed, like with the Julian calendar. Festivals, games, and public events mark the rhythm of collective life. The memory of the past is constantly reorganized to legitimize the present. Rome doesn't just dominate territories, it tries to dominate the narrative of time. The past is rearranged, the present glorified, the future projected as a natural continuation of what already exists. It's as if the empire is convinced that its clock can keep ticking forever, as long as you keep making adjustments here and there. But like any complex mechanism, there's a limit to how many patches you can apply before you need to stop everything and rebuild. Rome doesn't stop. Rome doesn't deeply overhaul its foundations. It reorganizes, adapts, changes its appearance multiple times, but rarely accepts reducing its size, lowering its ambitions, or rewriting the logic that drives it. Instead, it keeps betting on its ability to buy time. pushing conflicts ahead, delaying decisions, patching crises, and that mentality is exactly what, centuries later, will prove fatal. Not because all those adjustments were useless, they absolutely prolonged the empire's life, but because they accumulated internal tensions to the point that Rome became extremely vulnerable. Rather than acknowledging the limits of its own clock, Rome kept tightening, demanding more, stretching further. The result wasn't a single explosion, but a long process of wear until something that once felt unshakable simply couldn't hold together anymore. In the next part, we'll dive into the period where Rome reaches its territorial and administrative peak, and at the same time becomes too big, too expensive, and too dependent on temporary fixes. We'll see how. From the outside, the empire still looked like a giant, but from the inside, it had been running in the red for a very long time. If you're still here, that's a good sign. This deep dive is making sense for you. So again, drop a like. Tell me in the comments what struck you most in this first part. Was it the Romulus and Remus myth? The manipulation of the calendar? The idea of Rome as a clock running at its limit? And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next parts of this series on the real reason Rome fell. After understanding how Rome shaped its own mentality, born from a myth of sacrifice, fed by constant manipulation of time, and sustained by a sequence of political patches, we enter a phase where, from the outside, everything looks better than ever. This is the so-called peak of the Roman Empire, a gigantic territory. Impressive cities, roads cutting across entire regions, monuments, amphitheaters, aqueducts, professional armies, and a powerful sense that Rome isn't just a power. It is the power, but that's the surface view. When we open the mechanism again, we see a pattern that already appeared back in the Republic. Impressive short-term solutions combined with an accumulation of long-term tensions. The Roman clock is ticking, the hands look good, but the internal gears are under pressure that almost no one fully understands. Imagine you're flying over the Roman Empire at its height. From above, what do you see? In the west, cities in Gaul, Hispania, and Britannia, all connected by roads that converge toward Rome. To the south, North Africa, with major urban centers, ships carrying grain across the Mediterranean to feed the capital. In the east, ancient Hellenistic regions, cities like Antioch and Alexandria, rich in culture, trade, and knowledge. And scattered everywhere, legions, strategically placed, garrisons at key points, forts, watchtowers. This landscape is not easy to administer. It's not just brute force, it's logistics, bureaucracy, information flow, the ability to collect resources, redistribute them, and maintain a minimal sense of order. To manage all this, Rome builds an increasingly complex administrative machine. Provincial governors, tax collectors, officials responsible for military pay and movements, couriers transporting official messages along the roads. For a while, this machine seems to work well. The Pax Romana isn't a myth. There really is a period of relative internal peace, especially when compared to the decades of civil war that ended the Republic. Local economies develop, trade flows, cities grow, monuments go up. For many people, living under Roman rule means a more stable life than in previous systems. The emperor's figure becomes the ultimate symbol of that stability. But, as with everything in such a huge system, there's a cost. Keeping roads in good condition demands constant maintenance. Keeping professional armies far from home demands a steady flow of money, food, and equipment. Keeping the elite content in Rome and in the provinces demands concessions, offices, benefits, honors. The administrative machine isn't neutral. It has to be fed all the time. So how do you feed this machine? With resources from taxes, tributes, wealth extracted from provinces, trade, and labor. In theory, the cycle should balance. Rome offers security, infrastructure, and order. In return, it receives taxes and loyalty. But as time passes, that balance gets harder to maintain. The empire is no longer in the same intense expansion phase as before. The great conquests that once brought in huge bursts of wealth become rarer. Borders stabilize. At the same time, the cost of maintaining those borders keeps going up. Rome needs adjustments. And here, once again, we see the pattern of immediate solutions that buy time but charge interest later. One way to cope with the cost is to raise taxes. Another is to create more indirect levies. Another is to grant tax privileges to certain strategic groups, meaning someone else will have to carry a heavier burden. In many regions, the tax load becomes suffocating, especially for small landowners, peasants, and the urban poor. At the same time, the army becomes not just a tool of defense, but an institution with a life of its own. Soldiers expect regular pay, bonuses, rewards, land grants at the end of their service. Generals expect prestige, influence, political power. In many cases, emperors need to secure the loyalty of the troops, because they know a disgruntled army can spark a coup. This creates a dangerous link. The highest authority depends not just on legal legitimacy, but on the ability to satisfy military interests. To keep the soldiers loyal, you have to pay well. To pay well, you have to collect more. To To collect more, you put more pressure on the provinces. And the more pressure you apply, the higher the risk of local revolts, tax evasion, and corruption in the tax system. The machine keeps running, but increasingly at its limit, demanding sophisticated administration in a world where communication is not always quick or reliable. Another key point: the empire is not homogeneous. In some regions, contact with Rome is seen as a benefit, access to markets, citizenship, protection. In others, it feels like domination, exploitation, loss of autonomy. The same structure that looks like order from one angle can be deeply resented from another, that forces Rome to make local adjustments, granting citizenship here, cutting deals with local elites there, striking specific bargains. Another layer of complexity added to the clock. As time goes on, a strange feeling emerges within the system itself. To keep everything as is, Rome must work harder and harder. The empire's peak is not a calm, static landscape. It's a tightrope. On the outside, everything still looks under control. On the inside, it's constant tension management. Some emperors are more capable, others less. Some can coordinate administration relatively well. Others get lost in palace intrigues, favoritism, paranoia, persecution. Again, concentrating power in one central figure has an upside and a downside. If that piece is strong, the whole structure holds. If it's weak or unstable, the whole structure trembles. And because the empire is now so big and expensive, every oscillation at the top creates massive impact. In moments of crisis, Rome turns to measures that seem smart at the time, reorganizing provinces to better control taxation, creating new administrative layers to oversee existing ones, granting more authority to certain officials so they can act quickly in emergencies. In practice, this inflates the bureaucracy even more. More offices, more salaries, more people who must be maintained by the system. Meanwhile, we see the rise of a kind of outsourcing of security. Keeping Roman legions everywhere is expensive. So, in some cases, Rome begins making deals with peoples beyond the borders, especially Germanic groups. These peoples are invited in as allies, federates, frontier guards, sometimes even receiving land inside the empire in exchange for protection and military service. On paper, it's an elegant solution. Reinforce the frontier without expanding the regular Roman army too much. Save money, create a buffer between the empire and more distant groups. But again, this solution has long-term costs. By bringing these peoples into the imperial logic, Rome creates relationships of dependence. In calm times, federates may be loyal, cooperative, and benefit from the arrangement. In times of crisis, when the empire fails to pay what it promised, to grant benefits, to protect specific regions, the relationship can sour quickly. Alliances can turn into tension. And these groups, who now know the Roman system from the inside, are better positioned to pressure it. While all of this is happening, another layer of transformation is underway. Cultural, religious, and symbolic changes that shake the foundations of imperial identity. From the 3rd century onward, the empire faces intense crisis, frequent civil wars, emperors who rise and fall quickly, military coups, invasions, epidemics, economic difficulties. It's as if the clock begins to malfunction more often. Lights flicker, the hands get stuck. The system constantly needs reboots. Rome is in permanent crisis mode. This is the context in which major reforms emerge, like Diocletian's famous tetrarchy. The idea is easy to understand. Instead of one emperor handling everything, the empire is divided into regions with multiple rulers, more than one Augustus, more than one Caesar, each responsible for part of the territory. In theory, this should make administration more efficient and borders more secure. In practice, the tetrarchy shows two very clear things. First, Roman elites knew the old model was breaking down. Second, the chosen solution was not to reduce the system's overall weight, but to redistribute it. The logic is the same: adjust the clock so it can keep running a bit longer, without dismantling and rebuilding it in a more compact way. Dividing the empire among more hands is another way of buying time in the face of a crisis that can no longer be ignored. These reforms bring some relief, but they also create new problems: disputes between co-emperors, difficulty maintaining orderly succession, sometimes direct competition between different centers of power. Instead of one clear center, you now have parallel centers. The empire, which was already too large, must now deal with the fact that its own leadership has become fragmented. At the same time, religious changes are reshaping the social imagination. Under Constantine and his successors, Christianity moves from being a persecuted minority to an increasingly favored religion, and then, over time, the dominant one in many areas. This isn't just a spiritual shift, it's a change in how authority is legitimized, in the relationship between political power and belief, in the very notion of order and destiny. Roman identity stops being tied exclusively to old pagan traditions and is gradually reinterpreted through new narratives. All of this creates a paradoxical scenario. In some aspects, the empire seems to be modernizing and adapting. In others, it looks more and more dependent on patches that don't address the roots of its problems. The administrative, fiscal, and military machinery continues to demand high levels of resources. One alternative would be to drastically cut costs, which might mean giving up certain frontiers, reducing the empire's size, breaking long-standing privileges, re-evaluating the whole model. But Rome does not want or does not manage to make that move voluntarily. Instead, it tries to keep everything: the territory, the structure, the symbols of greatness. At this point, the Roman clock is running at maximum tension. Small shocks, which, in earlier times, would have been absorbed with relative ease, can now trigger large-scale crises. A military failure at a frontier can open the door to mass migrations. A succession crisis can turn into civil war. A local collapse in revenue can destabilize the supply of troops thousands of kilometers away. And it's precisely in this high-pressure environment that the so-called barbarians come more forcefully into the picture. But again, they don't appear like a meteor from nowhere. Many of these peoples have long been interacting with Rome in various ways. Some are allies, some trade with the empire, some are already integrated, serving in Roman armies, living on land granted by imperial authorities, participating in the Roman game. When external pressures like the advance of the Huns push other groups toward the imperial frontiers, the Roman system has to face something it's been postponing for a long time. Its model of control is no longer sufficient. The imperial peak, then, was never a period of pure tranquility. It was a time when Rome's classic habit, manipulating time, adjusting rules, improvising clever solutions, was applied on a massive scale. Each decade brings a new reform, a new arrangement, a new way to try balancing an increasingly heavy structure. And like every system that grows beyond what it can genuinely sustain, Rome becomes, at the same time, a colossus and a prisoner of itself. In the next part, we'll watch this rope being truly tested. Invasions, mass migrations, internal crises, desperate attempts to save what could still be saved. And most importantly, we'll see how the so-called fall of the Western Roman Empire is far less a bolt from the blue and far more the moment when a clock, pushed to the limit for centuries, finally seizes up. If this deeper look at the empire's peak is making sense to you, hit like. Tell me in the comments what struck you most about this phase. Was it the invisible cost of Roman greatness, the growing dependence on the army, the outsourcing of security to federate peoples? And subscribe so you don't miss the next parts of this series on the real reason Rome fell. We've reached the point where, from above, the Roman Empire still looks like a gigantic machine in motion, but inside, it's in everything on the edge mode. Administration is more complex, the army is more expensive, taxation is heavier, dependence on external allies is greater. Rome is trying to keep multiple plates spinning at once. Frontiers, internal crises, administrative reforms, religious pressures, political disputes. And any one of those plates dropping can trigger a chain reaction. To understand what happens next, we have to abandon the idea that Rome was living in peace and suddenly got invaded and knocked over. In reality, for at least 2 centuries before 476, the empire goes through a sequence of crises, some more intense, some a bit contained, but all pointing to the same problem. The model has reached a point where every temporary solution has to be more drastic than the last. One of these big waves of crisis is the so-called 3rd century crisis, a period when the title, Roman Emperor, almost becomes a synonym for extremely dangerous job. Emperors rise to power backed by armies, ruled briefly, are overthrown, assassinated, replaced. At certain moments, there are multiple rival emperors in different regions, each trying to claim legitimacy. From the perspective of the Roman clock, this is devastating. The command center, which was already a sensitive piece, now starts oscillating at high frequency. One moment, a group has access to resources, privileges, support. Shortly after, that same group may be persecuted, removed, expropriated. The system loses stability. Instead of a predictable rhythm, you get jolts. At the same time, frontiers that once felt relatively secure are under pressure. In the eastern and northern parts of the empire, peoples Romans call barbarians are on the move, testing defenses. Some negotiate, some attack, some simply drift across boundaries weakened by internal conflict. By a certain point, the empire isn't just dealing with an external threat. It's dealing with the dangerous combination of external pressure and internal fragility. On top of that, there are factors totally beyond political control. Epidemics, climate issues, harvest failures. These can reduce population, shrink tax bases, force migrations, destabilize local economies. For a system that was already running with little margin for error, that's like pulling bricks out of the foundation of an already shaky tower. Rome's answers to these crises follow the pattern we've seen many times: reforms, reorganizations, emergency concessions. Diocletian, for instance, tries to reorganize the empire in a deep way, creating the tetrarchy, dividing the government among 4 rulers, expanding bureaucracy, trying to control prices, restructuring taxation, tying people more rigidly to their social roles, peasants to the land. children to their parents' professions, to guarantee that the machine keeps moving. In many ways, these reforms extend the empire's lifespan, but they also reveal the cost of that survival. The system becomes more rigid, heavier, more controlling, and still depends on a constant flow of resources that, in many areas, just doesn't come in as it used to. The famous tax burden falls harder and harder on peripheral regions, often administered by local elites who, to stay afloat, treat their posts as opportunities to extract as much as they can. Meanwhile, external groups keep getting closer, in some cases, not as first-wave aggressors, but as populations seeking refuge, land, and security fleeing from even more violent threats further east, like the Huns. The story of the Goths entering imperial territory as refugees is emblematic. They're accepted, but are poorly managed, exploited by corrupt Roman officials. That leads to revolt, conflict, and eventually the famous Battle of Adrianople in 378, where the Roman army suffers a major defeat and the Emperor Valens dies in combat. Adrianople is one of those moments where the clock visibly jerks. A Roman military defeat is nothing new. Rome had lost battles before, but the combination of a destroyed army, a dead emperor, and barbarian groups settled inside imperial territory without having been fully defeated is a clear sign that the old formula, lose now, win big later, like in the time of Hannibal, is no longer working the same way. The system has lost much of its capacity to bounce back. In the following decades, we see figures like Alaric, leader of the Visigoths, who negotiates, pressures, advances, retreats, until the episode that every textbook mentions, the sack of Rome in 410. It's a shocking event, especially symbolically. The city that for centuries stood as the center of the Roman world, untouchable, now has its walls breached. Even if other cities at that time are more economically important, the psychological weight of seeing Rome sacked is enormous. But let's pause. The sack of 410 is not the fall of the Roman Empire. The empire continues to exist. Administration continues. Other cities keep functioning. Emperors still govern. What this event reveals is something else. That the clock that once seemed indestructible can now be struck in ways that would have been unthinkable before. The aura of invincibility is broken. At the same time, power is physically shifting on the map. For the Eastern Empire, Constantinople becomes the clear political center. In the West, Rome, and later, Ravenna, serve as the capital, but increasingly they are weak, exposed, hard to sustain. In practice, the empire is already split in two, a wealthier, more urbanized East connected to old trade routes, and a more rural, more pressured, relatively declining West. That asymmetry is crucial. The East manages, in many periods, to reorganize itself, resist, recalibrate its inner clock. The West does not. Its tax base is weaker. Its dependence on Federate troops is stronger. Its internal tensions are sharper. And even in the face of this reality, the Roman mentality resists the idea of shrinking, of giving up territory, of redefining what Rome is allowed to be. Instead, the system keeps itself alive through a series of progressive concessions, land grants to barbarian groups inside the empire, acceptance of non-Roman military leaders as key figures, increasing tolerance of local autonomies that, in practice, eat away at central authority. Think of the clock again. Now you have several gears almost spinning independently. Still technically attached to the mechanism, but with weak coordination. Some parts of the empire effectively function as their own kingdoms, simply using the Roman brand, the formal legitimacy of the emperor, while making decisions on their own. We can see this, for example, in the way certain Western military commanders build power, leaving emperors as relatively weak figures, sometimes almost ceremonial. One of these characters is Stilicho, a general of barbarian descent who, for a time, acts as a pillar of Western defense, negotiating, maneuvering, trying to balance conflicting forces. Later, we have other strong men like Rhizmir, who rules from behind the throne, making and unmaking emperors to suit his interests. The imperial title, at many points, becomes more of a piece in a game than a true command center. The main switch of the clock is no longer in the emperor's hand. It's in the hands of whoever controls the armies. That's a clear sign the system is running on improvisation. Instead of a clear hierarchy, you have a web of personal loyalties, informal contracts, and military dependencies. The empire doesn't collapse all at once only because there are still competent people trying to hold things together. Negotiations still work. Deals are still possible. But each crisis now demands more effort than the last, and every such effort adds to the wear. In 455, we see another sack of Rome, this time by the Vandals. Once again, the city is violated. Once again, the symbolic impact is huge. But as with 410, the empire doesn't vanish that day. It limps on, weaker, more fragmented, increasingly reliant on desperate measures. Until we reach the famous year 476, the Western emperor is Romulus Augustulus, a young figure who is effectively a puppet in the hands of Odoacer, a leader of Federate troops of Germanic origin. instead of maintaining the farce of a Western Roman emperor with little real power. Odoacer simply deposes him and sends the imperial insignia to the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople. The message is clear. We don't need to pretend there's an independent Western emperor anymore. From now on, I rule here as king, formally acknowledging a single emperor in the East. That's the act many historians use to date the fall of the Western Roman Empire. But see what this date hides when we treat it as a simple turning point. It suggests that before 476 the empire was solid, and then suddenly it collapsed. Everything we've seen shows the opposite. 476 is not the start of the problem. It's the end of a very long process in which the Roman clock had been overstrained for centuries. The real reason Rome falls is not found in a single sack, a single invading people, a single incompetent emperor. It lies in the collective effect of the empire's choices and non-choices across generations. Choices that favored short-term fixes over structural change. Choices that trusted too much in the ability to buy time and manipulate time, whether through calendars, administrative reforms, deals with military elites, or alliances with federate peoples. Choices that seemed clever in the moment but accumulated, weakened the system to the point of collapse. When we look at the 5th century, with its invasions, sacks, and depositions, it's easy to see only chaos. But if we place that century inside the longer story, we realize it's the concluding chapter of a long narrative of wear and postponement. The clock doesn't explode. It slowly loses precision, gets forced, is mishandled, until finally, it just stops. And here's something we often forget. Even after the West falls, a lot of what we call Roman continues to live on. The Church, structured in a Roman environment, preserves institutions and ways of thinking born in that world. Latin remains the basis for many languages, documents, and liturgies. Roman law keeps influencing ideas about property, contracts, and justice. Cities, roads, habits, none of this disappears overnight. What collapses is a specific political structure, that imperial machine centered on a Western emperor. In other words, Rome falls and doesn't fall. The empire as a form of government collapses in the West, but much of what Rome built remains. Precisely for that reason, understanding why the imperial structure didn't hold matters so much. The story of Rome is not just ancient curiosity. It's a powerful mirror for any system that sees itself as too big to fail. In the final part, we'll bring everything together. What, in the end, brought Rome down? What does this story tell us about any system, empires, modern states, big corporations, even personal projects, that gets addicted to pushing problems into the future, trusting that we'll figure it out later? And yes, we'll close this narrative with an invitation for you to look at that famous fall of Rome with completely new eyes. If you've stayed with me this far, that's a sign this journey through Roman time is resonating. So once again, hit like. Tell me in the comments what hit you hardest in this crisis phase. Was it the succession of emperors, the sacks of Rome, the Tetrarchy, Adrianople, or the realization that 476 is more of a symbolic endpoint than a sudden disaster? And subscribe so you don't miss the final part of this series on the real reason Rome fell. After walking through centuries of history, from the myth of Romulus and Remus to the imperial peak, from desperate reforms to the 3rd century crisis, from repeated sacks to the deposition of the last Western emperor, it's clear that the question, why did Rome fall, is far more complex than because the barbarians invaded or because the Romans became decadent. Those explanations contain fragments of truth, but they're shallow. Invasions happened, yes. Corruption existed, of course. Degeneracy in some habits, internal conflicts, all of that is real. But none of this, by itself, explains why an empire that lasted so long finally collapsed. The key to the answer lies deeper, in a more uncomfortable place, in how Rome dealt with its own limits. Let's go back one last time to the metaphor of the clock. From the beginning, Rome was assembling an impressive machine. First, as a city-state, then as an expanding republic. Later, as an empire. Each victory adds a gear, a lever, an axis. The system grows more complex, more interlinked, more ambitious. Every conquest strengthens the narrative of greatness. And with that greatness comes a seduction, the illusion that the clock can keep running endlessly, as long as you keep making small adjustments. But complex mechanisms have a catch. The more parts you add, the harder it is to maintain stability. To be fair, Rome did sense this at several points. Administrative reforms, military restructuring, tax changes, the Tetrarchy, all these show Romans weren't naive. They saw the problems, they tried to respond to them. But what pattern do we see in their responses? Almost always, Rome chose the solution that bought time without truly fixing the route. In the Republic, manipulate the calendar and extend mandates instead of directly confronting power crises. At the imperial peak, raise taxes and add bureaucratic layers instead of truly reducing the system's weight. In times of crisis, strike deals with federate peoples. grant favors to generals, improvise emergency power sharing arrangements instead of acknowledging that the core model needed rethinking. It's like someone living with a maxed out credit card. Instead of sitting down, reviewing expenses, changing their lifestyle, cutting costs. This person asks for a higher limit, takes a loan to pay another loan, juggles due dates, switches banks, works miracles in spreadsheets. As long as there's some credit left, it looks like it's working, but the debt grows silently. Eventually, you run out of banks, out of limits, out of tricks. Then everything collapses, not because of one bill, but because of the entire pattern. Rome is that sophisticated debtor. For centuries, it had an incredible capacity to renegotiate, patch, adjust, by time. The difference is that instead of dealing with banks, it was renegotiating with peoples, generals, local elites, soldiers, bureaucrats, calendars, gods, and, in a way, with time itself. And here we hit the central idea. Time is not infinite, not in the political, economic, and social sense. You can postpone conflicts, but not forever. You can overlook structural cracks, but not without paying a price. You can keep a facade of stability, but reality always collects in the end. What brings Rome down is not one single shock, but the cumulative weight of postponement. When the barbarians apply serious pressure at the frontiers, the Western Empire is already frail. Its tax base is eroded. Its administrative structure is heavy. Its reliance on alliances with military leaders is enormous. The sacks and invasions are, of course, traumatic events, but they fall on top of a system that's already saturated. If the clock had been robust, it might have absorbed those shocks. But it wasn't. And it wasn't because, for too long, Rome refused to accept its own limits. Think of some choices that could have gone differently. Voluntarily reducing territorial extension to concentrate resources on more viable regions. Simplifying administrative structures. Redefining what it means to be Rome. Allowing a smaller empire with more autonomous regions as part of a planned reform rather than a forced outcome. Those options existed, at least in theory, but they were rarely embraced clearly. It was politically and symbolically hard to let go of pieces of the empire, to say, we're going to be smaller, but more sustainable. That cut straight across the story Rome told about itself. So the empire kept trying to be everything at once, big, centralizing, sophisticated, expansive, even when the underlying reality could no longer support that model. It's like an aging athlete trying to compete as if they were still 20, ignoring pain, warnings, and limits until the body simply refuses to cooperate. When the Western Empire finally falls in 476 with Romulus, Augustulus being deposed, what we have is not a sudden shock, but a belated acknowledgement of a process that has been unfolding for a long time. The clock doesn't stop on that specific day. That day just marks, in a highly symbolic way, that the old mechanism can no longer hide its failures. And remember, even after the West falls, a lot of Rome lives on. The Church, deeply shaped by Roman administration and culture, carries forward Roman structures and modes of thought. Latin remains the backbone of many languages, texts, and liturgies. Roman law continues to influence how people conceptualize property, obligation, and justice. Cities, roads, built environments, they don't vanish overnight. In reality, what falls is a particular political shape, that centralized imperial structure in the West. Much of Rome's legacy is too deeply rooted to disappear with a single deposition. That's precisely why understanding why the structure collapsed is so powerful. The story of Rome is not only a story about back then, it's a huge mirror for any system that sees itself as too strong, too big, or too sophisticated to fail. Think of modern states. Think of global economic systems. Think of giant corporations. Even personal life projects. Often, the logic is similar. As long as things are growing, internal cracks are ignored. As long as there's credit, the debt doesn't feel so bad. As long as headline indicators look good, deeply rooted problems are pushed into the future, categorized as something we'll handle later. It's easy to look at Rome and say, well, that was the past. Another era, another mindset. The uncomfortable part is seeing how similar Rome's logic is to our own. How many times do governments postpone essential reforms in favor of short-term popularity? How often do companies massage numbers, cut in the wrong places, or delay necessary restructuring just to keep shareholders happy for another quarter? How frequently do we, as individuals, refuse to face serious issues, health, finances, relationships, and soothe ourselves with quick fixes, pills, minimum payments, and excuses? At its core, Rome is the story of a brilliant, creative, adaptable system that was also proud, inflexible at key moments, and addicted to easy exits. A system that survived crises that would have wiped out other people's, and that survival, ironically, fed the illusion that there would always be a way out. That no matter how tight things got, Rome could always reform once more, negotiate once more, adjust once more, until it couldn't. So when someone asks, what was the real reason Rome fell? The most honest answer is not a single word. It's not barbarians. It's not corruption. It's not Christianity. It's not moral decay. The real reason is the sum of all these factors inside a pattern. The inability to recognize and respect limits. Territorial, economic, administrative, human. Rome tried to control time through calendars, political cycles, and power structures as if it were a fully malleable resource. But time is also a boundary. At some point, the decisions you postpone come back. At some point, the bill arrives. At some point, the clock makes too much noise to be ignored. That's why, instead of ending this story looking only backward, it's worth turning the camera toward today. What kinds of empires are we building right now? And we don't have to mean literal empires. It could be an economy built on endless consumption, a political system that refuses to face structural issues, a work culture that demands infinite productivity from finite people, or just the way each of us structures our own life, trying to juggle everything, all the time, without ever stopping to adjust what really matters. Maybe the biggest lesson from Rome's fall isn't a warning about external enemies, but about the countless ways a system can quietly undermine itself from within. The question stops being who will invade us, and becomes what are we postponing today, believing time will always be on our side. Rome believed, for a long time, that because it was big, with a glorious past and sophisticated institutions, the future would always bend to it. Until one day, it didn't. That's why the title of this video is The Real Reason Rome Fell. It's not what you think. The goal isn't to deny the usual factors, invasions, internal conflicts, religious change, but to reframe them. The fall isn't lightning in a clear sky. It's the final chapter of a storm that had been building for a long time, while many chose to look away. The real reason Rome fell is the collision between a system that refused to change at its core and a reality no longer willing to support it on the same terms. If this way of looking at Rome made you see this story differently, now it's your turn to act here. If you made it all the way to the end, go ahead and hit that like button. It really helps this kind of content reach more people. Share this video with someone who loves history, or with that friend who always repeats the usual cliches about Rome's fall and might be ready for a deeper view. And I really want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me what struck you most in this journey. Was it the idea of Rome manipulating the calendar early on? The hidden cost of its great wars? The way later reforms bought time without fixing the core problems? Or the parallels with our world today? If you enjoy this kind of analysis that doesn't just skim over the surface of events, but tries to understand the logic behind them, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We're still going to talk about other empires, other collapses, other crises, and the unsettling similarities they have with the choices we're making right now. Thank you for staying until the end of this trip through Rome's clock. History may seem distant, but if you look closely, you'll notice its gears are a lot more like ours than we'd like to admit. See you in the next video.